All right, hello again. Let's dive into a little bit of GIMP and Dogwaffle together. What I'd like to do is essentially grab one of these pumpkins and then maybe a whole series of them into a lineup, kind of like this, and then turn this into an animated GIF or a MNG, a movie NG. So there's a couple of ways to do that as an export from the GIMP. And initially we'll start with getting this into Dogwaffle. So here we go. We just started Howler 11. This will not work with PD Artist. You need to have the animation capabilities of Howler. And what I'll do is I'll just briefly explain how I got this image to be in an animation. Essentially, if you load this into a brush, you can usually do a Control P. You have a copy and a paste, and you have now that image in here. And you'd like to have a bunch of them in a series, right? Now, this one is going to be all the same. Maybe you have a whole bunch of different ones, something like this one here. If you copy that into Howler, then what you could do is simply piecemeal it, right? Take one section at a time and recreate a sequence of images. There's actually a tool to do that for you in an automatic way. Let me store this image and show you one thing you can do. If you have an array, this is basically an array of images. In gaming world, you often see this as something that we call something different, and I forget the name right now, but essentially you have an array of images. These are all the same size and all centered around, let's say, the nose of the pumpkins. And you could help it if you needed to adjust positions or place them manually there. You could do something like artist guides to show additional lines. And you could show something, let's say, something like subdivisions like this in the horizontal, and the same or something similar to this. So you have reference. Well, that's not the right number. It should be 3 and 2 or something like that, or 3 and 4. At any rate, you have some visual aids you can use to place the individual pumpkins in the right place. And I would always zoom in a lot so that you can have a nice fine definition. Then when you zoom out, it looks even more perfect. Now the question is, how do you turn this into simply a horizontal animation, a lineup of individual animation frames? There is this tool. I mean, you could do this manually, but here's a tool called the Array to Animation. And we do have 2 horizontally, that's 2 columns, so we'll put that in there. And then we'll have along the y-axis, we have 3 items. And they are all taken, right? Sometimes you have one that's an empty. If you only had 5 in there, the last one might be blank. So you would do 5 here. But here we have 6, so everyone is going to be taken. And what it does is it takes each of those and breaks them into individual frames, and now you have an animation sequence, right? So that's one thing you can do quite easily to create from an array of images that are laid out in a regular set of cells. To turn that into an animation, right? And so now the question is, how do you turn this into, for instance, an animated GIF? Well, you could export it, right? There's a couple of ways. Some of the exports here will give you a GIF animation, for instance, but it's not highly optimized. It's not compressed. It's not doing a number of things you'd probably want to do also, like change the color range, make the transparent, like the black one here, to be transparent. That's really the matter of something like GIF Movie Gear or some other GIF animation specific tool. If you have Photoshop, use that. If you have, well, let's see, there is a tool called, of course, the GIMP. Who cannot be aware of that? The GNU image manipulation program, and I call it sometimes the graphic image but that's because it's what it does. But it's a GNU, it's an open source and free program, and it's a great program at that. And so what we'll do is we'll export this into an animation. And in fact, as an animation sequence, right? Save it as a sequence so that you can, let's say, for instance, you wanted to save it here, sequence 1 or something like that. Like give it a name, pumpkins, sequence 1, or something like that. and you could save them as PNGs or as targas. I'm going to go PNG here. That's a very broadly used format, and Targa too, of course. That's our default preferred for export. But with PNG, you can also, in fact, have it transparent. You could make it first make all the black stuff transparent, and then you would have it as an image with PNG, but not in the sequence. The animation itself doesn't have that. Now we can actually do a parallel animation with just the mask. That will work. That will export with transparency. That'll be another tutorial, right? There's a few extra steps. Let's keep it simple here. So we'll do without transparency for this first pass. We'll call these frame underscore, and we know it will add a number to it, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So let's just give it the base name frame, and then the rest will happen by magic. And so here it exports each of the frames, and they are not ideally positioned. You can see they jump around a little bit. So that's something we could also perhaps cover in a separate tutorial, how to move them around, right? This one here relative to that. You can actually enable, I'll just give you a pointer here. You can enable the light table. So then you actually see multiple pumpkins, multiple images, the neighboring images next to each other. And so that sometimes will help you in adjusting the brightness of the current or the next or the predecessor frames, and then and maybe even do a red shift, blue shift, so that you can see the images before distinct from the images after, right? So it helps a little bit in your orientation through this mess of semi-transparent layers. But at this point, what you could do is simply go to the current image that you want, if you want to move it around, right? And then select something like transform shift, and you know that you can simply move it around to a point where it lines up with the others, right? Don't move it around too much, but you can certainly make it so that it will line up. Maybe you have the reference lines with the artist guides. You can do that as well. I'm going to go leave it as is and not do much detailed work on that. The point of this tutorial is to export it to an MNG, the movie NG format, which is basically like the moving PNG equivalent. All right, so we've exported that as an image sequence. We can now switch over to the GIMP. And I have a version here which is not considered the stable version yet. Yet we can still work with that. The way that this works is that we will eventually go to the filters, and under filters there's an animation capability and a series of filters for animation, but also to playback the animation and also to optimize it for future exports to GIF or to some other reasons. I'm not too familiar with this one exactly if I want to use it, so let's skip that for today. We'll just go to see the workflow. First of all, we'll need to open a bunch of images as layers, right? Because that's the way that GIMP will handle an animation. It's going to show one image, one frame in the first layer, the next frame in the second layer, the third one in the next layer, and so on. So you'll have a stack of images that are not showing at the same time, like partially overlapping, side by side, combined in screen mode or whatnot. No. What it's going to do is going to show one frame, one layer, right? And then the next layer is containing the next frame, and it's just playing back one layer at a time. And so that's the technique we can use in the GIMP to make it an animation. And so what we'll do is we'll go to the File menu and import as layers or open as layers. Right. And so we need to go somewhere where we have a bunch of images and image sequence. We actually did that as an exercise a little bit earlier. So I do have a few here too, recently used. And the question is, can I go to simply, maybe I can go, let's see, a sequence here, 64, 63. These are actually animations that I created of the same family of pumpkins, but I rotated them. There are some that are not so good. Let's see if I can take just a few. You can do a shift click to select a bunch, have a whole group there, or you can select control click selectively. Let's say you have an image sequence that have way too many frames and you want to take only 1 out of 3 or every other. You could do that, right? So there's a couple of ways to skin this baby. And let's just grab a few and hope they're all the same size. You see they're changing colors. That's one thing I did, is I applied some filters that would give them a different appearance. different, maybe blur, maybe saturation, and so on. The whole point is that you can grab images in many different ways. All right, so I'm going to open those and hope that they are all the same size. You can see here now it's building the images into one layer per image, and we now have a sequence that's a set of frames, and we could go and hide all the others to just see one. But that's really what we want to do just in the animation. So if you want to test this now, we simply go to Filters and Animation, and in here you can go and play it back. All right, so when you have the playback, you actually see only one image, and then the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. So here's a little animation that we just created that way. All right, this one is from a different image sequence that we had than the one we exported earlier in this tutorial, but that's okay. You see the same concept here. And then the other thing too is, this is an example where I did label or mark the background as transparent. So you see this plaid pattern indicating that these pixels are transparent, so they're not actually showing themselves. They may be black, they may be white, they may be any other color, maybe some gray, but because they are transparent, you don't get to see that, right? And so that's the starting point to actually go and export it. So how do we export this as an MNG? And that's the magic trick here. You have export as, or simply some regular export option. I thought there was a other export option, but this one is certainly useful. Let's go do that. And when you export it, you can select the location. Let's say I'm going to go into the same folder here, or create a new folder, and say, come on, or maybe that's not working yet. Like I said, it's not fully released yet. But what we can do is we can certainly give it a name here that's a little bit unique. Perhaps we'll say demo export 1, something like that. And this will not be a PNG. We are exporting the whole animation. So make sure you change the format here. There's a couple of animation related export options you'll see in the list here. There's a FLC, flick animation. And there are a couple of more. There is a GIF, but I don't know that that one does animated export. There maybe, I haven't experimented with that yet. Maybe we'll cover that in another tutorial. There should be something like an animated GIF, I suppose, but then again, I don't know. Maybe they put it into this export and it will just magically do its stuff. Maybe after, maybe I need to first optimize it for GIF. I don't know. So I haven't had time to export that yet. What I want to do is keep going down. And that's the beauty of this program, by the way. There's so many formats it already supports. Look at that. There's ours, Targa image. That's TGA is our favorite in Dogwaffle. And for a number of reasons, including some historical, and others are more hysterical. But anyway, let's go back to PNG, or rather the animated version of it, the MNG, and there it is. All right, so here's the MNG animation option. Let's go export to that. And click export, and what you see here, oh wait, hold on a second. Oh, I need to give it an extension. Okay, let's give it that MNG. There you go, and see if that makes it happy. There it is. Now we have a dialog for the MNG export. Okay. And there's a couple of things pre-selected already. I don't know. I haven't read up on the user guide, so I'm not sure that I want to mess with that or change it. Some of these are actually not available for selection. MNG, I guess, is, but look at that. I cannot unclick it, so that's a shame. It's not quite fully implemented, or maybe that's a bug. I don't know. But it's probably not going to be counterproductive. Still, it's good to have the option sometimes not to have it saved in interlaced mode. There's a couple of other things you'll want to experiment with, especially the frame disposal. Right? Do you want, see what's happening is it displays one frame and then waits a fraction of a second and then displays the next frame, and then it waits another fraction of a second, and that delay is something you can control. You can say here at the bottom, default frame delay. You can say I want 10 frames per second. That means each frame needs to hold 100 milliseconds. Right? So you could go faster by saying 50 milliseconds. Now it's going to play at 20 frames a second. Right? If you want to do 30 frames a second, you probably need to do about 33 milliseconds. It's an integer number here, so you can't do exactly 33 per second. But you can do, or 33.333 that is, but you can get very close. And so one of the common ones to use is 100 milliseconds, because that means it's going to do about 10 frames per second. It's going to take 100 milliseconds for each frame. You can say show it only once or loop it, right? If you uncheck that, it's not going to loop it. Other things you could do here is some compression for PNG. Since we're doing PNG based movies, MNG is basically a PNG type of sequence. You can control some compression level here to make it very little compression or a high compression, which then gives you a smaller file size. Again, I did not experiment with that yet. I don't know how big an impact this will have, how significant the difference will be. It will also be a function of the actual images, the content of the images, right? Imagine if you have very noisy images with a different color every other pixel. It's going to take a lot of space to capture all that. So if you compress it, it's going to lose some of that, but it's going to make it smaller. Whereas if you have something very cartoony with only 2 or 3 colors in it, there's not much changing going from one pixel to the next. Most of them are going to be very efficiently compressed already. So there's perhaps less to be expected with higher compression level. I don't know, I'm not the expert at this particular file format, but that's sort of my basic idea about it. The default frame disposal is to combine it. You might want to just say replace it. Now, what is the meaning of combine? That usually means that we expecting to provide images that don't contain the actual images, but rather how they have changed from the prior images, right? The difference. And so you can do that. You can do the optimize first. I don't know if you recall under the filter menu with animation, there was an option for optimize, and that's sort of a difference analyzer, and then it only records in the frames what pixels actually have changed relative to the same pixels of the prior frame, or something like that. I don't know the fine details, but that's a typical thing to do in GIF, in MNG most likely too. It's basically find me differences. So let's combine what we have with what's coming next rather than just replace. If we know we didn't optimize it for difference compression, then we simply say let's replace it. It might also have a beneficial it might have a benefit on the appearance. Sometimes, depending on the player, the browser, the system, and whatever else is going on, you might see a little flicker. Combine might first do a clear and then redraw, or there's all sorts of little other side effects that one or the other might have, and it's not universal. It's going to be different from an iPhone to an iPad to an whatever. And when you play it on an Android or to a PC or a Mac or a Linux, depending on which browser you use, Edge, Internet Explorer, Chrome, Firefox, you name it, Mosaic, no, probably not anymore. But you do have potential for slightly different behavior. So it's good to know that you have a couple of options to export it and test it, right? Verify that it looks the way you want it to look on the target delivery format or platform. All right, so I'm going to keep it at that and then export. And so at that point, we're done. We've exported this. And the magic now is simply a matter of going to the folder. Let me go find that folder. Oh, here it is. So here is the folder in which I have a bunch of images, and some of them are, of course, for development for the stickers we are going to put on the app. But there's one here that I created. There it is. That one doesn't have Windows doesn't have a preview for it, so you don't see a thumbnail other than whatever viewer is associated with it. My beloved cat here. Earphone view, but if you double click that, hopefully it knows how to play it, and yep, there it is. So you now have a little animation that it can play back, and it is quite possible that it may be able to zoom in, but then again maybe not, right? So some playback, some formats you can temporarily zoom in on the current frame, but then when it keeps recycling it resets it. So that's normal. Maybe you can find a way to resize that. Now it's an animation. I'm not sure that I would hold my breath on that. I don't know that it resizes every frame of such an animation, but it's a possibility. It's probably worth trying here. Let's see if this one does it. Resample, and let's go double the size or quadruple. Yeah, no, it doesn't do that. Okay, so that's lesson learned. It's a viewer. This is not, well, I mean, it does a lot. If1 View is really phenomenal at so many things. But what we want to do is perhaps sometimes get in a larger image. And if you know how to apply a resize on the entire image sequence of every layer, bless you, that's awesome. I have not taken the time to explore it, so I don't know if that's easily possible. What I'll do typically is I'll go back to my program, Dogwaffle, and I'll do that here. So I'll say, oh, I want maybe even more frames, and I'd hold them a little bit longer. Maybe I'll do, or reverse the frame sequence. Maybe I'll want to time stretch it and say make it 4 times as long, double it with frame blending. That may look a little bit nasty, but hey, why not? Let's try that. And so now you see them blend and transition, and there's so many other things you could do here, including resizing them, right? So for instance, you could say, let's go, in fact, no, let's do a couple of things. In fact, we want to go time stretch in the other direction, which is to reduce it, and then maybe make the black background transparent, right? We could do that too. We can right click. Actually, it's a brush we would need to do that on. So let's keep that for another tutorial. Let's keep this one short. But I do want to do the sizing. So we have a resample. We can do that. Let's say we want to make it in fact smaller. Let's say back to 222, something like that. Oops, that's a height of an odd number. I don't like those. I'm going to change that a little bit. Nobody's going to notice 148 instead of 147. Well, I do know one person who would, but long ago a student next to me in college. But he had an amazing eye for differences by down to 1 or 2 pixels. In print, on paper no less. But what we'll do here is also perhaps invert it, perhaps turn it to grayscale, apply that to the whole animation. You know, you have the timeline, you can do all sorts of filter changes here. So there's lots of options here beyond just resizing it. And perhaps we want the same color at the very end, right? So keyframe that, but then in between here we want a bit more red, a little bit less blue, a little bit more green, something like this. And then here we want no blue, just total green. Oh, that's odd. Okay, so that's really too much. Something like this. Maybe no red. Yeah, that's a green. Okay, something like that. And apply that, so you now have a sequence of colors. So you get the idea. There's tons of filters here that can be used before you go and actually export it to then turn it into an animated MNG in the GIMP. Alright, and I think with that I have completed what I wanted to cover in this tutorial. There's always so much more I want to say, but so little time to actually say it. So I'm gonna zip it and keep it completed this time. Thank you for watching, and thank you for exploring the possibilities of working with Project Dogwaffle and with the GIMP. If you are running on Windows, you have that option, and I hope you take advantage of it. Alright, thanks very much. See you next tutorial.